Right, good morning everybody. I'll just give it another 30 seconds in case anybody else joins, but thank you for spending some time this morning to join this Allstar webinar on the cost considerations when managing electric vehicles in a small business fleet, but this does apply to large business fleets as well. Just to do a bit of compliance this morning, everything we discuss in here is our personal views and not the views of Allstar or Corpay. This is definitely not tax advice, so please do get your own tax advice before implementing anything we discuss on this webinar. I'm joined today, thankfully, by Phil Hale, who's Head of UK EV Sales at Corpay. Phil has been in the fleet and fuel card world for the last 15 years, so what Phil doesn't know about fuel cards probably isn't worth knowing. And also Jeff Whitcomb, he is a chartered accountant with 33 years experience advising companies on employee reward and employment tax related issues. So hopefully we'll get into some detail here on the tax side of things. Also, just to give Jeff a plug, he's from BCF Wessex, so if anybody wants to speak to Jeff or engage Jeff and his business directly for some more bespoke tax advice, definitely reach out to Jeff and we can share his details after the webinar. So before we get into the discussion around costs, we thought we'd just play you a little video just to give everyone a very brief overview of what Allstar Chargepass actually is, because appreciate there's a lot of existing customers on the webinar, but some people don't know the full ins and outs of Chargepass. So hopefully, if we've got some sound and the video works, over to you, SJ, to press the play button.
In a world where businesses are transitioning to a more sustainable future, managing a fleet has become more complex. Allstar Chargepass is the UK's only fleet payment solution that does it all: fueling, public charging, home charging and so much more, while keeping costs clear and under control. Access 90% of the UK's fuel sites, including all major oil brands and supermarket sites, and one of the UK's largest and fastest electric charging payment networks for businesses. With Allstar Home Charge, your drivers can charge their business vehicles at home whilst payments are accurately and automatically made direct to their energy supplier for costs incurred, helping to eliminate out-of-pocket expenses and complicated claims. Allstar Online simplifies fleet management by consolidating invoicing, detailed reporting and comprehensive account management, giving you full control and visibility over your fleet's costs, all in one HMRC-compliant invoice. No matter the size of your business or how you power your vehicles, Allstar Chargepass does it all. Apply online today or inquire to learn more.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, so we're just going to kick things off really with the general macro picture in the state of play, because the government and the tax incentives from the government have really been the driving force behind EV adoption over the last 5 years, especially in the company car space. So if anybody on the call is running company cars in the fleet, you probably do know about the benefit in kind that the government has put in place to incentivize us to adopt electric vehicles, which has mostly been the driving force behind the salary sacrifice scheme as well. So they started out at 0%. There is a roadmap to take us all the way through to 2030. We are currently at 3%, but as you can see from the slide on the screen now, we've used an example on the right hand side of how that impacts the individual in pounds and pence in their pocket. So the average car costing £30,000, if that was petrol, the tax the tax hit on that, if you like, nearly £1,500, whereas today that is £180. So again, it may be that is all there is to say about it, but I don't know if Jeff, you've got any more detail on benefit in kind other than what we've presented here.
Yeah, I think it's worthwhile bearing in mind, Ash, that some changes coming in from this April, so the 6th of April, that were announced by the Conservative government several years ago, and sort of kick in from the 3%. EVs will go up 1% per year until 2027. So we're going to go 3, 4, then 5. And then we're going to get further increases of 2% per annum for the following 2 years, which were introduced by the Labour government in the last budget. So that's how we'll get up to 9% by 2029-30. So that's the roadmap, which I think for most people in the automotive sector has sort of proven to be what might be called a soft landing. You know, there were fears that we were going to go up to very heavy levels of BIK on EVs, but I think they've all seen that we still need to incentivize the uptake of EVs. So that's quite good. I think the overarching theme is that we've got these measures coming in from this April coming next month, which were Conservative. Then we've got the Labour ones from 2028. But just to flesh this out, if you drive a plug-in hybrid electric car, commonly referred to as a PHEV, they're going to go up 1% per year for the next 3 years as well. And then we've got a sharp increase in PHEV taxation, because in April 2028, they'll jump massively to 18%. What the Labour government is trying to do is to differentiate PHEVs from EVs and make them more like petrol or diesel cars and taxed that way, just subject to their CO2 emissions and not by reference to their zero emission range, which is how they're taxed at the moment. So we're going to see a very steep increase for some PHEVs, the lower emission PHEVs. And I was looking at one last week. I believe one of the Audis or one of the Mercedes has got CO2 emissions of circa 7 grams per kilometre, and it can do something like 88 miles of zero emission range, and its MPG is about 940. So take that as you will. But that's going to go up from somewhere in the region of 8% to 18% in one jump in April 2028. So there's some big changes coming for PHEVs. As far as other cars are concerned, so petrol, diesel, we typically call those ICE cars after the internal combustion engine. They're going up 1% from this April. Then they're going to be frozen for 2 years. And then they're going up 1% per year for a couple of years. But what's key there as well is that we have a maximum percentage of 37%, which is hit around about 150, 160 grams per kilometre. That's actually going to go up in 2028 to 38, and then again in 2029 to 39%. And that's the first increase in those maxima for quite a while. So I think we're seeing a couple of things. Obviously, as EVs get uptake, there's less incentive required for them. And obviously, we've got the ZEV mandate coming in as well in 2030. So, you know, we're going to mandate that these things are taken up. So again, less incentive. But we're seeing some tax rising measures as well in there, Ash. The government is looking to squeeze more out the BIK tax as well. So we're getting a combination of the two. But that's the real overview.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I mean, it's very interesting on the on the PHEV picture as well, because I think lots of people have been buying PHEVs to run in their fleet, and the majority of people, certainly that I speak to, often don't charge them, which, you know, generally means they're actually probably far less efficient than having a pure petrol, maybe with a more efficient engine. So I can see why the government potentially wants to bring in that change to benefit in kind. But yeah, I think it will have a big impact, because certainly we're seeing people buy our Chargepass cards to use on the PHEVs, and quite a lot of the usage that we see just goes purely into fuel, you know, which does indicate that they're not being charged. So Yeah, so for anyone out there, I guess that's just probably something to keep in mind, that if you're committing to a 3 or 4 year FEV lease deal, you want to be careful that the benefit in kind doesn't catch you out.
It's probably worthwhile mentioning as well, Ash, about the rehomologation of FEVs that's coming, and by that, basically, the way they're tested is going to change, and so you're going to see the CO2 emissions of FEVs increasing. There's one well-quoted example in the fleet press about a BMW X1, which is going to go from somewhere in the region of 46% up to 94% when what they call utility factors are increased. So anyone thinking of looking at FEVs needs to consider when they buy them or lease them, and what might happen by the time that car might be delivered. Now, once it is delivered and it's got a CO2 emissions on its certificate of conformity, it will never change, but it could change in the period from order to delivery. And that's going to really significantly impact the taxation of FEVs. And I would anticipate it's going to significantly impact the take-up of FEVs as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can definitely see that as soon as that becomes common knowledge. Absolutely. And I think it's fair, right? I think we've probably been kidding ourselves on the efficiency of FEVs until recently. So that does make complete sense. Just before we move on, the Q&A is open. So if anybody has any questions, pop them in there, and we'll pick them up in the middle or towards the end of the webinar. So moving on from benefit in kind, because I think this is quite clear. And also just to mention, this table we've got in here, we did publish a white paper towards the back end of last year. It's available on our website. We'll circulate the link. This table is in that white paper, along with some more detailed information around the tax and the roadmap of benefit in kind. So another thing that some people know about, but a lot of people don't know about, is the workplace charging scheme. So this is a government grant that the government introduced. They've just extended it to the 31st of March 2026. And in summary, it allows businesses to claim up to 75% of the total cost for the purchase and installation of EV charge points in the workplace. But that is capped at the maximum of either both of these, £350 per socket, with a maximum of 40 sockets per site. I don't know many people that are installing 40 sockets per site, but that is it's significantly helpful to anybody that is installing chargers in the workplace. We are going to talk about the cost of home charging, workplace charging, and public charging, but generally workplace charging is one of the cheapest places to charge. It's also a great incentive for employees, and as far as I'm aware, unless anything's changed, Jeff, workplace charging is also nil when it comes to benefit in kind. Yeah.
Yes, there's a specific exemption for it, Ash, and that's for any car, whether it's a company car or a private car that can be charged. There's no benefit in kind on it.
Which is very nice benefit to offer your employees if you do want to give them free electricity, or even if you want to deduct the cost from gross pay. So yeah, worth checking out that. If you just simply Google workplace charging scheme, one of the first links that come up will be the government website, and there's all the details on there. But most or any reputable installer will have all the details and be able to help you out with the paperwork that you need to apply for that. So probably moving on to one of the biggest costs that we need to consider when running electric vehicles is the actual cost of the electricity itself. And this really is where we, or you as the fleet operators and drivers, can have the most influence over cost savings. So one of the things we've been doing now at Allstar I think for almost 2 years, is publishing an AllCosts report. So this is using our own data from millions of fuel transactions and hundreds of thousands of EV transactions to give some indication of the true cost of charging. If you go and Google cost of running electric vehicles, you will get data that's different to what we've published here. But what we've got here is real life from our customers, and some of these numbers are higher than we expected, and some of them are lower than we expected. So again, you kind of have to take this in some ways based on your own experience. But here we've got an example of two vehicles, an executive car, which generally we're seeing a lot of. You know, this is kind of Tesla Model 3, if we're allowed to speak about Tesla anymore. But as you can see, home charging significantly cheaper than any of the other forms of fueling. Public charging, sadly, is now the most expensive way of fueling, followed by petrol and diesel sitting in the middle. But the most important thing to remember here is that you need to have a charging strategy. One of the biggest mistakes that we see from our customers is they are deploying electric vehicles, giving their drivers potentially one of our Chargepass cards and saying, off you go and find the nearest charge point and charge up. And what they'll generally do is find the fastest, which then probably results in the most expensive. But then you're also not only paying more for electricity, but you're paying for someone to sit on a public charger. So this is where you really need to lean in, if possible, to home charging or workplace charging, because those that can charge at home, typically we see 85% plus of the charging being done at home. And just to kind of bring this to life in some whole numbers, we have got some data here. So I think on the next slide, SJ, here we go. Yeah. So this is pence per kilowatt hour, which again might not mean much to a lot of people, but 24 pence is the average cost of charging at home, 77 pence per kilowatt for the average cost of charging in public, so a third of the price. And if we were to translate that into what it looks like per annum, average car doing say 10,000 miles a year, and this is dropped now, back in 2024 would have been around £970 to charge at home. We're now seeing that come in at around £830. So, you know, you can compare that to the cost of filling a car with fuel over 10,000 miles. You're seeing thousands of pounds worth of savings over the life or life of the lease there. So what are we going next? Sorry, apologies. I'm getting messages as we're talking. Yeah, I don't know if there's any. We've not heard from Phil. I know. Sorry to throw you on the spot there, Phil, but I don't know whether you've got any insight from a sales perspective over the conversations that you or your team may be having with customers, and you know, I know we're strongly trying to encourage people to take up home charging, because it really does save people money. But yeah. Don't know, Phil, have you got anything that you want to share with us on that side?
Yeah, thanks, Ash. So for those that aren't aware, Allstar are obviously the UK's largest fleet card provider. We have over 1.2 million card holders, and we deal with customers from owner-operator with a single vehicle right up to some of the largest fleets in the UK. And when we look at EV strategy across the board, every business has their own ideas about how they're going to electrify their fleets. Some have given it tremendous amounts of consideration, and they have built a strategy that's based around the entire charging ecosystem. So giving their drivers the ability to charge at home, potentially charge at work, and then of course charge on the road. Others have approached it slightly differently, and it's simply because they've got a fantastic lease deal on some new electric cars that they're looking to electrify their fleet. And what we typically see in those instances is customers will invariably take the option which has the least upfront expense, and they will take one of our Chargepass cards, and that allows them to access 60% of UK charge points. And yes, it works fantastically. Yes, it's a really seamless experience, but of course, to Ash's point, public charging is expensive, and of course you've also got the hidden cost of driver downtime. Now, I know the industry will wax lyrical about trying to utilize and make if I can get my words out, try and take advantage of that downtime to get work done, but it's not always the case for people in many industries. And so what we typically tend to see, around 60 days later, businesses start coming back to us and saying, hey, the Chargepass card's working wonderfully, but is there another alternate to charging or potentially supporting us with charging domestically or charging at work? And domestic charging, to Ash's point, is A, significantly cheaper, but B, also eliminates that driver downtime. So drivers can come home, plug in, and wake up to a full charge every morning. And for those drivers, that forms pretty much 85–90% of their entire charging requirements. So it becomes so much more cost effective to operate an electric vehicle, and in doing so, actually becomes cheaper than operating the equivalent ICE vehicle as well.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Phil, on customers going for the cheapest or the lowest barrier to entry. And various different fleets will look at this in different ways, but some of our biggest fleets have said, look, if it costs £1,000 to install a home charger, ignoring even the cost of electricity, we'll recover that purely in downtime. And even if you're looking at people being productive while they're charging, they still have to find a charger, get out the vehicle, plug it in, get it started, unplug it, get up to speed. There is a lot of unproductive time there. And we definitely appreciate that not everybody has the luxury of being able to charge at home, but we see hundreds, if not thousands of drivers that can charge at home that say to us, oh, I wish my employer would pay for a charger. And they say, well, I'm not paying £1,000 for the charger. And actually, while Phil's just been talking, I've just found some more stats from our latest AllCosts report. So 100% charging in public for a vehicle doing around 10,000 miles a year, £2,500, versus we've got a figure here of £700 for home. So you can see the immediate saving there if you can create a hybrid charging strategy. So that's essentially, I guess the high level points really of the main costs that you need to consider when running vehicles. But I think it does come back to think about this before you deploy the vehicles. Lots of people think it's let's get the vehicle, get people out on the road, get people charging them. But usually where customers feel the most pain and get the most pushback from drivers in electric vehicles is where they haven't necessarily thought about their strategy of how they're going to be charged, because and it doesn't necessarily take too much thought and too much effort. It's just worth doing it before the electric vehicles land. So we had a nice structure to this webinar, and we've blended everything into this first section. So I don't know from Phil or Jeff anything we've not covered. Jeff's got his hand up, so I assume there is something there.
Yeah, I was just going to add, Ash, just some points that would be very worthwhile bearing in mind. You mentioned about home charging, and Phil talked about that as well. If an employer pays for a home charger to be installed at a employee's home, and that employee's got a company car or a salary sacrifice car, that in and of itself is not a benefit in kind. Likewise, the employer could actually pay for the electricity as well, and that's not taxable either. So there's still a lot of incentives around there. You've both also mentioned workplace charging. There are not only grants available, as you've set out, Ash, but there's tax relief available as well. So if a company put in a workplace charger, it can get a first year allowance on that charger. And what I mean by that is the whole cost of the charger is offsettable against taxable profits in the year in which it's installed. So there's still incentives around for chargers as well as EVs.
And do you think there's any risk that the government's going to do any U-turn on these incentives and policies? Obviously, and we've got the roadmap, the benefit in kind roadmap does apply to the charges. Like, are we at risk that they're going to sort of pull that, do you think?
Yes, would be the short answer. So just to pick up on the grants that you've mentioned and the first year allowances I've mentioned, they were due to expire this month and they've been extended for a year. I think we're going to get series of 1 year extensions, and they're going to see how it all goes, what the take up is like, etc. And then they'll pull it. It's a bit like something we haven't touched on, but from next month, EVs are going to be subject to vehicle excise duty, which most of us will refer to as road tax. So there's a gradual whittling away of the tax advantages and grants for electric vehicles, and I can see that continuing. If I could say it, a sort of suck it and see approach. They'll see how successful the take up is, and they'll gradually withdraw them.
Yeah, and I think that's inevitable, and they have to plug this hole that they're creating by moving people to electric somehow eventually in the future. And you mentioned vehicle excise duty there. For people who don't know the cost of that, that's a fixed fee, right? As far as I understand.
Yeah, well, it's been more complicated over the years. So from this April, an EV, so a zero emission car, will have a £10 first year charge. And for other cars, it's judged by their zero emissions, by their emissions. And by the time you get up to, I think it's 255 grams, the first year charge is somewhere in the region of £5,500. So there's a heavy penalty for taking a gas guzzler. What happens from the second year onwards is that we just go to a standard £195 fee for any car, regardless of its emissions. So the EVs are coming into that charge for the first time as well. And then for any car with a P11D value of £40,000 or greater, they're subject to the expensive car supplement, which is going up to £425. And EVs are going to be subject to that as well. Although the government has mentioned a consultation on that, because EVs are typically more expensive than their ICE equivalents. So is that £40,000 set at the right level? That consultation hasn't started as far as I'm aware yet, so there doesn't seem to be a rush to move on it. So essentially, an EV registered from the 1st of April will fall within the full gamut of VED charging. If you've got an EV that's currently on the road, it will go to the £195 standard annual charge when it's next renewed. Its registration is next renewed after April, but it's not subject to the expensive car supplement, so it isn't subject to that £425 if its P11D value is above £40,000. And if you go all the way back to cars that were registered before 2017, they're just going to fall into the £20 annual tax bracket, again with no expensive car supplement. So it depends when it's registered. But if anyone has got an EV on order and they can get it registered by the 31st of March, you'll save yourselves several £100s.
Some good advice there, right? So, what, 14 days, 12 days to get them registered.
Yeah,
get them on the road. And then we've got the spring spring budget coming up soon. Anything we expect to change in that? I know you've not got a crystal ball.
Frankly, no. I think when Rachel Reeves delivered the budget last autumn, she said that it was a once in a parliament tax raising budget. Obviously hasn't gone down very well with the Nick changes, and that's having an effect on the economy. So what we're currently seeing is obviously there's a wide ranging debate. There's going to be announcements today about welfare cuts, but when the Chancellor delivered the budget in October, she thought she had a roughly 10 billion pounds worth of headroom. If you think that the economy has stagnated since that budget, we actually were in decline in January, the last published figures. So the growth that she was forecasting isn't there. That headroom of roughly 10 billion, according to the Resolution Foundation, is going to be probably a deficit of about 4.5 billion. So we're going to see an awful lot of focus on the welfare cuts, other spending cuts. There's going to be a restructuring of the civil service, which they think will generate savings. To the extent that we have tax raising measures, I don't think there'll be anything aimed at fleet. All the stuff I'm reading is about a reduction in the threshold that we can all put into our cash ISAs, or maybe they might look at inheritance tax again and expand that. But something that the Resolution Foundation are proposing is another freeze on personal allowances and tax thresholds. So they're already frozen until April 2028. So if they were frozen for another year, that would generate 5 billion. And if they were frozen for 2 years, so, i.e. all the way up to April 2030, that would generate 10 billion. And given that these numbers that I'm quoting in terms of deficits and surplus are all about in this parliament, she can kick the can down the road, do a freeze on allowances and meet her fiscal rules. So I don't think there'll be much, but if there is anything, it could well be on allowances.
Okay, good to know. So I guess just bringing it back to some of the basics of EV charging again, one of the questions that we do get asked quite a bit from customers is, are there any grants to install home chargers? Now, there were, and while a home charger is expensive, it's not expensive in the grand scheme of charging, but the grants we did have effectively made the cost of buying and installing a home charger around £350. Do you think we'll ever see any grants come in to incentivise home chargers again, or do you think we've seen the end of it?
There's still a grant for renters and flat owners, and you can still get grants for some on-street parking. A little earlier, whilst you were speaking, Ash, I put in the chat a link to the OZEV website. So if anyone clicked on that link and then followed the other links, they can see what all the grants are. I don't foresee that there's going to be a general grant available to anyone like there once was. But there, I remember when I got my first EV in 2016, you know, we had a fairly hefty grant then on the EV and the charger. You know, I wouldn't qualify for anything now. But I don't see us going back to those days, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I think it's probably the right thing that we don't go back to those days. I think they were there at the start to really drive those early adopters to buy electric vehicles. You know, these were the days when all you could really get was a Nissan Leaf or a Zoe, and you know, they weren't very desirable cars. So having those grants there really did help people get into those electric vehicles. But I think, you know, in some ways, I think it's kind of a little bit unfair just to put the grant on the home charger, because there's lots of people that can't take advantage of that. So yeah, I think you're right. I agree. We probably won't be going back there. Maybe just changing the topic slightly while we've got a bit of time left. I mean, if you were to read the headlines in most of the mainstream media, you would think that every electric car just combust spontaneously, and you can't get them insured, and they just run out of charge without you realizing. I mean, Phil, you probably hear more of these myths from customers than anyone else, and people telling us they're never touching an electric vehicle until they're dragged into one. Like, any interesting myths or funny myths or anything you want to share that's clearly not true about electric vehicles?
No, it's a really good question. And I think when we started selling EV more meaningfully back in 2019, 2020, there probably was a little bit of miseducation or scaremongering perhaps around EV and EV adoption. We get asked questions from customers such as like, can you drive an electric vehicle in the rain? Is it possible to charge in the rain? I hear that you can't take an electric vehicle through a car wash, all of which hopefully the audience now know not to be true. I think the other key point was the grid won't be able to cope with the demand of electric vehicles charging. And I think people often use the nation turning on their kettles after Coronation Street finished as a point of reference. I think to reassure everybody on the webinar today, the National Grid have now, of course, made it clear that there is currently enough capacity, and the growth of offshore wind farms, other renewables, new nuclear power mean they are comfortable that they'll be able to keep up with demand. And of course, not every EV charges at the same time, and we are, of course, seeing utility providers incentivize the charging of electric vehicles out of hours with cost-saving tariffs, which means that we shouldn't see the demand on the grid that perhaps we once anticipated. And I think we also heard feedback, probably quite rightly, from customers that there was no infrastructure. And at the time, when we're talking 5 years ago now, the infrastructure was perhaps quite limited. And when you turned up at a motorway services or a services on a major A road, you probably were greeted with one lone rapid charger. And while that perhaps met demand to an extent, we did start seeing mass EV adoption that meant supply or demand outstripped supply. But I think the charge point operators in the UK have done a really fantastic job of improving infrastructure. And hopefully you can all agree when you do turn up to a motorway services, you're now greeted with multiple banks of chargers as opposed to just one lone 50 kilowatt charger. And I think the last one, and perhaps is still true to an extent in certain instances, is EVs don't have enough range. I think going back 4 or 5 years when there wasn't the selection of electric vehicles as there is today, yes, you could pick up a Nissan Leaf and it probably would do 80 miles real world range, which for many business drivers simply isn't fit for purpose. But as battery technology's improved and prices have come down, vehicles with longer ranges are now far, far more accessible, and they're in an abundance of choice as well. So I think as we progress towards that 2030 deadline, we will start to see vehicles exceeding that 450, 500 mile range point in cost-effective price brackets as well. So the myths around EV that perhaps existed a few years ago, some of them were simply not true. Some of them perhaps did have an element of truth to them, but as the industry's evolved, I think less so.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think, it's, I hear it all the time, especially the grid can't cope one. I think that's interesting, and if anyone is interested in the detail of that, National Grid have a report that you can download on the website to say how they are planning to improve the grid and the capacity to make sure they can not just meet but exceed the demands of electric vehicles over the next, I think it's right up to 2035 or even 2040. Just one other thing that I think is worth mentioning as well before we sort of close off on the subject of costs is winning over the hearts and minds of drivers. So if you are a small business and you're trying to encourage your employees to take up electric vehicles, especially as company cars or more probably more relevant vans, if the drivers themselves are not bought into the idea that they want to make electric vehicles happen, they will almost do anything they can to make sure that driving that vehicle becomes painful, not just for them, but for you as the employer. They'll do things like find the most expensive public charger, or even if you have installed a home charger, they'll not plug it in. They may say they plugged it in and it hasn't charged, so then they have to go and spend an hour charging on the road. So winning over those drivers to ensure that they actually want that vehicle and they want it to succeed is really important. Otherwise, it will ultimately end up costing you as the business. So, any questions we've got from the audience? I don't know whether Jan, we've got anything, the voice of Jan there that we want to ask.
We don't have any questions yet, but do encourage people to ask any questions if they have. I'll keep an eye. There are a few that we've had before the session started. I think you've touched on some of them, especially around sort of best advice for encouraging drivers. And if, just as a note, if you are an Allstar customer, there is a driver survey that you can use to sort of test that out with your drivers to see how many would be available or open to charging at home. Other questions include referring to public charging and home charging and the nuance between rapid and slower. So when we talk about public charging, obviously there's the AC and DC charging. So you've got rapid, which tend to be the more expensive, and then the supermarket type charges. But is there any strategy around that that we would recommend?
I'll take this one, Jan. So I think fundamentally speaking, when we look at the roaming or public charging network, chargers typically tend to fall into one of two categories. You've got destination charging, and these chargers typically tend to exist on major A roads and motorways. And they typically do tend to be those rapid and ultra rapid chargers that give drivers a good level of charge in a short period of time, allowing them to get on to their onward destination. I think you've then got another category of charger, which is probably those near home chargers. And these are really aimed at the population of people who perhaps can't charge at home because they live in a flat, they live in rented accommodation, they have no off-street parking, but still need to charge near to where they live and wake up in the morning with a full charge. And these typically tend to be slower chargers, sort of 7.4 kilowatt or below, lamppost charging, curbside chargers, and invariably these chargers are very much aimed at individuals who can plug in on an evening and then unplug in the morning as they set out for their day. And there is quite a cost discrepancy between the two, as outlined in our reports. And so it's really a case of ensuring that you're using the right charger for your needs. I think when you're on a major A road or motorway, unless you are stopping to do a Teams call like this, of course, or do some administration, then obviously time is of the essence. But then when it comes to more residential charging, you do have the ability to charge for longer, and therefore it makes sense to do so at a lower cost. So it's really important when you consider your EV charging strategy and how your drivers charge, in ensuring that they are behaving and using the right charger at the right time to ensure that not just the cost of charging is impacting the business, but the cost of that driver downtime as well.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, all good to know. And there's lots of information, loads of data that we've shared here, and we will circulate the links to the white paper and the all cost report, because if you want to, obviously we've thrown loads of numbers at you here, but they're all in those reports. So if you want to download those reports or refer to them, they're all available through those links. The final thing that we'll mention on here is we have been doing some research, and with the help of Jeff and BCF, into whether you can salary sacrifice the charging costs. So you run a salary sacrifice electric vehicle, can you actually salary sacrifice the charging of that, which in effect would save your employees up to 40%? And in most cases, the answer is yes. So we'll not get into too much detail on that on this call because we are going to be launching something relatively soon. But if you want to know more in the meantime, feel free to reach out to us. I don't know if there's anything else to say on that, Jeff, without
yeah, I think the way the market's going, Ash, is the benefits on salary sacrifice are pretty straightforward. You sacrifice salary, you get income tax and NIC relief on it. So picking your example, UK higher rate taxpayer, they're going to get 40% income tax, 2% NIC relief on the salary they sacrifice, but they will pay BIK tax on the car. And as we've seen, that's going up from currently 2% to 9% by 2030. The benefit with chargers, so home charge points and charging, whether that's at home or on the road, is that you still get the income tax and the NIC savings on the salary sacrificed, but those aren't taxable benefits in kind. So they're pure savings, really. So what we're seeing with the way the salary sacrifice market is going is moving definitively from car to include charger and now to include charging. So I think this will continue over the next few years.
Excellent. I mean, hopefully it's going to be great for the employee, but also as an employer, it's a great benefit to offer your employees if you can adopt these salary sacrifice schemes and take advantage of, I guess, the salary sacrifice opportunities there. So we will launch, we will publish more information about that over the next few weeks because we are launching a product that will hopefully help you support drivers who are in salary sacrifice vehicles, salary sacrifice their EV charging as well. So that's pretty much it in terms of content. While we've got a few potential customers or even existing customers on the call, we do have a couple of slides that I'll just run through just to talk about the benefits of Chargepass. Some of you may know this already, but I'll just take 2 minutes just to cover the highlights. So in terms of our on-the-road network, that now has 59,000 plus chargers available. The Chargepass card, the Allstar Chargepass card, is now a single card. It covers fuel and EV charging. So if you do have mixed fleet or you even have a FEV, you can use the same card to cover all locations and all fuel types. Just move on to the next slide, SJ. Yeah, so fuel network, again, lots of you know this, but we do have a lot of EV-only customers. It is the largest fuel network available on a single card. 90% of the UK is covered. I know this is an EV call, so we'll not get into too much detail on the fuel network, but again, all this available on the single card. And then Allstar Copilot. So this is an app that we realize lots of our customers don't have. If you don't have it, it's worth downloading it. It will help you locate the nearest charge points or fuel stations as well. It tells you the prices. It tells you if they're available. We've got new features coming to this app all the time. So we keep getting asked by our drivers, can we have things like average speed that's coming out the charge point, because some charge points are advertised at say 350 kilowatts when they'll only deploy 50 kilowatts. So lots of exciting features coming out the Allstar Copilot app. Definitely worth downloading that or asking your drivers to download that if they haven't already. And that is it. I think finally we've won lots of awards. Yeah, sorry, probably should have blown our own trumpet here, but yeah, you don't just have to take our word for it. We are this solution that we've built around Chargepass is an award-winning solution, and we've got a few case studies coming to the website, so you can hear about fleets like Centrica, obviously a huge fleet, but also some smaller fleets, how they've adopted electric vehicles. It's worth heading over to the website to have a look at some of the real life case studies and real life stories from some of our customers. And then finally, I think we have some QR codes. Yes, excellent. So all the data we've talked about today, if you scan the QR code, it will take you to the white paper, and we'll also distribute a link to the AllCosts report that has all the data and all the costs of charging, fueling, diesel, petrol, everything you need to know. So thank you very much for joining. I know lots of you have given up an hour of your morning. Massive thank you to Jeff and Phil, and also SJ and Jan for hosting this call and making it possible. Thank you very much.